Okay, everyone. Hello. How are you all? We're a very intimate group here, Rosella. Sorry, Rafaela. I know people do it all the time to you. I'm sorry. So welcome to Federation Hall, and everybody who's joined us on Zoom, welcome to you in Zoom land, and welcome to Federation Hall virtually. If you haven't met me before, my name is David Sequeira, and I'm the director of the Fiona and Sydney Meyer Gallery here at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music. And before I introduce our guest speaker, please join me in grounding yourself in the deep knowledge that long before the faculty or the university was thought of, that the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation practiced song and dance and made paintings and shared stories and practiced healing long before we were considered. And it really is a great joy and honour to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Our guest speaker today, Rosella, is an Australian artist working at the intersections of socially engaged art and long-form documentary practice. Rafaela has spent over a decade co-creating photo-based projects alongside women in her life who she identifies in her practice as co-creators. These include her identical twin, her stepsister, and new and old friends from across several communities. Rafaela's artistic practice draws heavily on relational exchanges and a collaborative ethos to resist bureaucratic representations, for example, case files and criminal records, by presenting everyday stories of women's connectedness, belonging, and kinship. This has resulted in a co-creative archive of photographic works, video works, sound recordings, state-issued documents, criminal indexes, and ephemera. Rafaela and her co-creators seek to highlight the intimate dimensions of their lived experiences and unveil the interlocking structural systems, institutions, relentless bureaucratic process, and violent histories that maintain the prison industrial complex. Thus, their interests have shifted to consider more deeply the value of their co-created counter-archive as a site of resistance. Rafaela's work is currently on display in We Us Them CCP X Belfast Exposed at the Centre for Contemporary Photography, and we're indebted to CCP for their assistance in making this presentation happen. Wherever you are in Zoomland and in Federation Hall, please make Rafaela most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I guess before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people of Meanjin, whose lands I'm very grateful to live. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to elders past, present and future, and all First Nations people here today. I'd also like to express my deepest gratitude to the First Nations co-creators, advisors and families on my projects, and pay my respects to the Gomeroi people of the Gamilaroi Nation and the Widjewal people of the Bundjalung Nation, where my co-creators and I make our work together. Sovereignty has never been ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Apologies in advance, because this might be a little bit of a academic presentation, but I'll try my best to not read as much. No, I'll probably read, but anyway. My name is Rafaela Rosella, but my co-creators, my childhood friends know me as Rosie. As mentioned, my practice has emerged from my lived experience of being raised within a heavily policed, not letting me change the thing. Being raised within a heavily policed, low socioeconomic community where I've seen my sisters, friends, partners, and extended family move through the prison system. My socially engaged art practice until now has employed an immersive autoethnographic approach to documenting everyday life through photography, moving image, sound, recordings, and the collection of ephemera, such as state-issued documents and criminal indexes. This practice has emerged over 15 years with contributions from several women in my life to resist stereotypical representations of our lived experiences, resulting in what we now consider co-created archives. These women are my friends, family, and extended kin who are now identifying my practice as co-creators. In addition to my personal collaborations, I also have 14 years experience working within community engaged art, first as a participant and more recently as a community artist. Drawing from the tensions that I experienced within community engaged art, I began my research to question whether community engaged projects, including participatory and collaborative practices adopted by documentary practitioners, actually move beyond collaborative rhetoric. However, over the last year, I've narrowed my inquiry to engage in a broader dialogue around the power and authority of state archives, photography's complicity in maintaining its regime, and their connection to the PIC. In simple terms, the PIC refers to the interaction of bureaucratic, political, and economic interests that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Therefore, my research examines how co-created archives can resist bureaucratic representations of women whose lives intersect with the PIC. An autoethnographic approach doesn't come without its challenges, which leads me to identify the limitations of this work. The stories I co-create with women in my life intersect with my own lived experiences. Therefore, these stories are not entirely my own. They implicate my co-creators, our friends, our families, and communities. As this research includes First Nations and non-First Nations co-creators, deep engagement in these concepts requires me to adopt culturally safe methodologies to minimize the power my positionality brings. Despite growing up with a Widjabul Yagal stepfather and having several nieces and nephews who belong to the Bundjalung Nation, my proximity to Blackness does not absolve my whiteness and the privileges gained by settler colonialism. Whilst my identity is complex and my way of being has been shaped by the people and communities who grew me, I'm still a colonizer. Therefore, just as photography has been laid with racist ideologies since its creation, I too am complicit in instilling structures of whiteness that continue to dominate power relations. Although carcerality has shaped my upbringing, I've never been incarcerated. I do not understand what it's like to be stripped of my identity and locked in a cage under the premise of public safety and rehabilitation. Therefore, it is vital that I only speak from my standpoint and work alongside my co-creators to determine their own representations. I grew up in Nimbin, New South Wales, and started photography in high school where I would document my friends and community. As young women, our choices were limited. Violence, addiction, dealing drugs, and becoming a mother at a young age were considered the norm. Rather than address the social and economic needs of our community, the police would routinely conceive elaborate plans to criminalize and control our community. These forms of state-sanctioned surveillance, criminalisation, and punishment result in a pipeline towards prison. In contrast to the relentlessly negative media coverage about my hometown and its open drug culture, I experience a close-knit community amongst a complex and extensive kin bound by blood ties and fictive kin. Given most of my friends and sisters became mothers much younger than what is expected by the broader Australian community, my first artistic collaboration, We Met a Little Early, But I Get to Love You Longer, explored the experiences of young motherhood. This included my identical twin, my stepsister, and new and old friends. My twin sister had a baby by 19, and my stepsister had 5 babies by 24. And like many of our friends and extended family, I also had several children by the age of 30. Along with my own babies, these children are my nieces, nephews, and godchildren. They have enriched our lives considerably, not mistakes as deficit discourse surrounding young motherhood might have us to believe. A lot has changed in our lives since our earliest collaborations. Just as our families have grown, so have our projects, with friends and extended kin contributing from across several communities. However, in recent years, our lives have increasingly intersected with the prison system. I never imagined my sisters and girlfriends would be incarcerated. Growing up, it was usually our boyfriends who were locked up. I now understand the growing number of incarcerated women in my life. Specifically, First Nations women account for the most significant growth in Australia's prison system. Instead of addressing trauma-related symptoms, including trauma resulting from the structural forces of racism and poverty, the current criminal injustice system supports the systemic oppression of women who in most cases are being punished for circumstances out of their control. Like a revolving door, I continue to witness my friends and loved ones pipeline to prison, where they enter, leave, and shortly return. Each time their sentence is a little longer and the paper trail a little thicker than before. Yet what remains forgotten within the administration, arbitrary decision-making, paperwork, court documents, police statements, criminal indexes, and case files that record these experiences are the intimate relations, family connections, social networks, and public lives of those directly impacted by the carceral state. These bureaucratic procedures and subsequent documents are not merely mundane administrative methods and records. They are sites of bureaucratic violence where decision is made, knowledge is created, and power is exerted in ways that affect the everyday lives of citizens. As a result, bureaucratic documents are often presented as the official record. Political theorist Rafaela suggests that studying archives as a regime helps to identify the particular forms of violence that the archive operates, contains, tames, standardizes, and regulates, and its role in the production of the imperial condition. In response to the singularity, I can't even say it, of these narratives, my current research seeks to examine how our co-created archives can resist this authority. For example, in 2017, during her 15-month prison sentence, Tamara would on her own accord would single-handedly highlight, redact, and amend the pages of errors within the criminal records and family court documents that marked her a criminal and unfit mother. Unveiling the ineptitude of the official record, Tamara's acts of resistance question whose voices are reported, whose voices are silenced, whose voices are deemed credible, and whose voices are not. Similarly, forms of documentary photography are complicit in producing narratives that criminalize, victimize, and marginalize people. Theorist Alan Sekula draws close attention to photography's role in producing archival regimes of power, which was developed in the 1940s to systematically regulate the so-called dangerous classes. Photography was made available to the lower classes, yet also functioned as a repressive tool capable of policing them. In more recent studies, curator and cultural historian Mark Seeley identifies photography as a complicit agent of colonial authority through its ability to create systems of image production that maintain and disperse dehumanizing ideologies. This is problematic because it creates categories of defiance that are inherently racist, exploitative, violent, and generally problematic. This has seen contemporary documentary practitioners move towards more collaborative, multi-authored projects. However, documentary photographer Gemma Rose Turnbull argues that this trend towards collaborative practice may lead to terms being enacted in a performative way. Critical race scholars Tuck and Yang argue it's a misconception that forms of collaboration solely resolve ethical issues of representation, agency, and voyeurism. There is now increasing interest within documentary practice from photographers like myself to move towards relational approaches that adopt a more long-form, intimate and autoethnographic process. So one of the consequences of long-form projects is that more power dynamics emerge, specifically the possibility that personal relationships may influence an individual's ability to withdraw consent. In developing my ethics application for my PhD research, the Human Ethics Committee rightly questioned how my co-creators can withdraw consent given our intimate relationships, particularly my identical twin sister, Mimi. For 8 years, my twin has struggled with an addiction to methamphetamines, commonly known as ice. It was during this time in 2015 that my sister was charged with commercial supply, a charge that carries a minimum sentence of 10 years to life. For a while, I stopped photographing my twin. The difficulty was that it felt like I was looking at myself, and the act of photographing her was enabling her addiction. From a place of love and concern, I often refuse to photograph vulnerable moments. Sometimes I'm tired navigating dual roles, artist and loved one. Sometimes I just need to put the camera down and be present as a sister, a family member, or a friend. And sometimes not every aspect of our lives is for an audience to see. If I think back to when my twin sister was at her most vulnerable, I can now recognize where issues around power and consent can easily emerge. Although I decided to put my camera down for my own well-being, I didn't consider my twin's right to privacy or her ability to withdraw consent, given the power relations that may have influenced her decisions. As a participant researcher, this has required me to consider several relational questions within my practice. How do I honor my relational responsibilities, yet present our lives in complex and truthful ways for an audience? And how can I work in a relational way without unconsciously forcing power over my co-creators and our intimate others? Power dynamics such as these lead to control remaining with the artist or the institution facilitating the project. This produces an environment where participants and co-creators lose control of their representations, enacting the same archival regimes that are embedded within the carceral state. This leads me to question who really benefits from collaborative artistic exchanges when the commissioning organizations, artists, or acquired institutions remain with power over the resulting archives, creative works, and their co-creators' decisions. My methodology for this research draws heavily from concepts of carceral aesthetics, a relational practice and framework that utilizes the creative constraints of the carceral state in art making. This framework was developed by writer, curator, and art critic Nicole R. Fleetwood. Just like I never imagined my loved ones would be incarcerated, I never intended to document our lived experiences across carceral divides. This is a term used to describe the physical and psychological boundaries that the carceral institutions produce. As several of my co-creators became routinely criminalized and incarcerated, our intimate relations and an immersive approach to co-creating became heavily restricted, particularly by punitive regulations of time, intimacy, materials, and the carceral limits these conditions set on what can be known. This meant that methods that we had previously used in our work, such as spending extended periods of time together and documenting our everyday experiences through photography, were no longer possible. As a result, we found ourselves developing creative strategies for visualizing and expressing the intimate dimensions of our lives as we navigated carceral bureaucracies and surveillance. Positioned across varying states of unfreedom, my co-creators and I started to record our relational exchanges. From 6-minute monitored prison phone calls with my stepsister and friends to handwritten letters that circulated between us. We began to collect evidence of this time beyond the bureaucratic representations that otherwise represent this experience. Behind bars, my co-creators produced personal archives, including journals, letters, family photos, state-issued documents, and criminal indexes that represented their criminality, such as prison identification cards, criminal records, mugshots, and their 6-digit MIN numbers. During their incarceration, they would mail these archives to me to contribute to our co-created archives. This has led me to examine more deeply the value of our co-created counter archives as a site of resistance. In considering that our relational exchanges occur under varying positions of unfreedom, I now understand how the co-creation of our archives are often shaped by these conditions. For example, free versus unfree, mobile versus immobile, captive versus roaming. Consequently, these conditions have impacted my ability to provide several co-creators ongoing consultation, engagement, and negotiation during periods of their captivity. For example, reviewing work, editing, and renegotiating informed consent. This renegotiation of consent is key to my methodology and would normally occur at significant development stages and before all publications. Not only are exchanges restricted and monitored through phone calls, visitations, and handwritten correspondence, imprisonment strips away a person's civil rights, making it impossible for the imprisoned to provide informed consent. In considering the power dynamics that shape artistic collaborations between incarcerated individuals and non-incarcerated artists and art organizations, Fleetwood proposes that concepts of consent and negotiation are fraught terms. They describe arrangements that take place between individuals and institutions who occupy disproportionate positions of power. For example, incarcerated individuals cannot access project budgets, licensing agreements, or receive funds for their contribution. At the end of the day, I'm able to enter and leave these punitive settings, whereas my incarcerated co-creators must return to enclosed boxes as criminalized and punished subjects. In turn, I've adopted a more flexible approach that carefully considers the various conditions and power dynamics that shape our artistic collaborations. This has resulted in the publication of our co-created works being pushed back, sometimes by several years. This is evident in the publication of our photo book, We Met a Little Early, But I Get to Love You Longer, which is due for print later this year, after 8 years of necessary intervals. Similarly, our multi-channel video work, Home Truths, which is currently screening at CCP, after numerous pauses since its first screening in 2017. The relentless imprisonment of several co-creators, relapses in addiction, the complexities of motherhood, pushing back against stakeholders who impose their own agenda, pandemic restrictions, and the sudden and tragic loss of Tamara has shaped our methodology, leading to the publication of these works being significantly delayed. The opportunity to share our stories with an audience is not our priority. Navigating captivity, grief, motherhood, and addiction without the pressure of our artistic collaborations has been far more important than publication timelines and deadlines imposed by Eurocentric art institutions. This has resulted in rewriting contractual agreements imposed by art institutions to ensure my co-creators have the right to control how their stories are being represented and presented. This resistance against subscribed frameworks within the art industry has enabled me to provide sufficient time and space for my co-creators and their families to review works, make suggestions, and renegotiate their consent. Instead, our focus has been more focused with how our co-created archives can function in a more practical way. For example, from 2015 to 2021, our work has supported 5 co-creators to obtain several significantly reduced custodial sentences and multiple successful bail and parole applications. Through this work, court judges and legal representatives have recognized the significant impacts of structural violence, intergenerational trauma, and institutionalization. This demonstrates the social impact of our work well beyond artistic appreciation and further establishes the multiple ways our co-created archives can function. Furthermore, in the days following Tamara's death in October 2020, I was forced to grapple with the shifting ontology of our co-created archives and the way personal archives can resist the documents that mark us. I hadn't fully understood the value of our co-created archive until Tamara's family gave me the responsibility to organise the photographs displayed at her funeral service. At the time, our co-created archive included an extensive collection of scanned childhood photographs, amended family court documents, criminal indexes, prison letters, audio recordings, ephemera, and our photographic co-creations, which chronicled Tamara's last 10 years of life. It was in these days following Tamara's death that I found myself trawling through her multiple Facebook pages and saving images she had posted online over the years. Even in death, Tamara's personal contributions have entered our co-created archive. Along with arranging Tamara's life into pictures, her family asked me to contribute to her eulogy and the victim impact statement that was presented within the courts. So the same institution that rendered her a criminal, the same institution that deemed her an unfit mother, the same institution that just a few years prior had sentenced her to a cage. Our statements didn't shy away from the difficult life Tamara lived, a life marked by violence at the hands of the PIC and its subsequent records. Although it's the gaps and silences within these records that represent times in Tamara's life where she was thriving. A permanent job, a stable home, building connections with her children, and a journey of sobriety. It's these positive moments in our lives that seem to remain undocumented within state archives. It will never be enough to add content to a system that is built upon imperial methodology that determines whose life has value and how their life is classified and accessed. Although this was our opportunity to contribute a counter narrative within state archives, a fuck you to those who ever deemed Tamara's life worthless. For us, Tamara was a daughter, a mother, a sister, a partner, an auntie, and a friend. In continuing Tamara's resistance against archival regimes of classifications, surveillance, and authority, my co-creators and I have drawn from Bell Hook's theoretical framing of marginality as a site of resistance to revise, redact, and resist the documents that record us. Therefore, I've been drawn to what Chilean pharmacist, poet, and translator Carlos Soto Ramon describes as the machinery of the bureaucratic and impersonal language used within state-issued documents, particularly victim impact statements transcribed by the police. In reviewing the police records of my sexual assault at 17, I was drawn to the repetitive language used throughout the document, particularly the words "the victim." Even though the violence from my intimate partner was horrific, it was the treatment from the police and the aftermath that left me feeling abused. Author Naomi Murakawa, whose research specializes in crime policy and criminality, argues simple stories of the perfect victim and the monstrous perpetrator bend reality to fit the pretext for state violence, helping us to pretend that physical, emotional, social, and civic injuries of prison are somewhere justice. At 17, I knew better. I knew prison wasn't going to heal me from rape or keep me safe from my rapists. Rather than unveil the details surrounding the assault and the violence that unfolded, I started to redact, only leaving the repetition of the words "the victim." The last sentence within my now heavily redacted police records reads, "The victim refused." Redaction is often used as a legal strategy to censor legal documents and protect bureaucrats. Instead, long-term co-creator Nunjal and I decided to use redaction as a form of resistance against the 318-page family court records that documented the state-orchestrated forced removal of her eldest son in 2020. Our experiments have involved testing approaches to create a large-scale wallpaper out of heavily redacted pages from these sealed records. We have used repetition of a document which states, "I have read and understood the statement of truth," to reflect the state's power to enforce its authority. In resistance to this statement, we placed a framed image of Nunjal and her son embracing each other within a body of water. The image was co-created just days prior to his forced removal. Resisting the narratives recorded within documents not only materializes sites of resistance, but draws on carceral symbols of surveillance, dehumanization, constraint, and the agency of my co-creators and I to challenge these representations. In recognizing that existing approaches in community-based art and documentary practice can be harmful, I began this research with the hopes of developing a trauma-informed framework for documentary practice. I was particularly conscious of Tucken Yang's position that retelling narratives of pain is troubling. Since meeting with my advisors, Carly Atkinson and Debbie Kilroy in 2021, to review the development of home truths, I now recognize that resisting re-traumatization can also be harmful. In removing the content that I felt may be triggering or portray my co-creators as victims, I was risking watering down the stories of injustice so they were more palatable for an audience. Mananjali Yugamber and South Sea Islander academic and writer Chelsea Wadigo, whose work foregrounds Indigenous intellectual sovereignty, highlights that politics of politeness are often only reserved for those who brutalize First Nations people. While I was concerned that my intimate relations with my co-creators may influence their decisions, I didn't recognize that by attempting to remove narratives of pain, I was replicating the state's ability to silence my co-creators. Despite ongoing photo theory on victimization, Atkinson highlighted that assuming my co-creators and I need to be coddled with processes that resist triggering us is condescending. Our traumas are there, we live with and manage them every day. Instead, Kilroy highlighted the importance of refusing to replicate carceral conditions, particularly the state's ability to shackle an individual's right to express themselves. These conditions are sustained by white supremacy and continue to reproduce representations of passive and powerless victims. In theorizing the extraction of stories by colonizers such as myself, Wadigo proposes it must not be extractive. It must restore agency, dignity, and power, including the power to narrate one's own experience, whether as victim or victor. Therefore, my approach to co-creation must support my co-creators to decide the fate of their archival material on their own terms. This brings me to my last question. What could an archive do if controlled by the people it seeks to represent, oppress, marginalize, or criminalize? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rafaela. I really appreciate your incredible generosity, not just in this talk, but in your practice. And we've got a few minutes for questions. So if anybody has a question, if you're in Zoom land, if you could send that question through using the Q&A facility. And if you're here in Federation Hall, just raise your hand. All right, the first question's coming. So the question is, thank you, Rafaela, for such a clear and moving talk on your extraordinary work. I'd love to hear more about the role of the camera in your collaboration. Is it you who always holds the camera? Do you have it with you at all times, or do you and your collaborators decide when you will film or take photos in advance?
Yeah, it's usually me holding the camera, but usually what we photograph is like co-conceptualized. In my earlier collaborations, I used to always have the camera with me and would document everything, but at that point I was using like a digital practice, and then later on I incorporated like film-based, like a medium format camera. But I also became a mother at that time, so like my process changed. It wasn't as immersive, and I wasn't using the camera so much. It was more about spending time together as parents, and just friends and family members. So yeah, like I often have the camera with me, but I don't always make photos. I hope that answers.
No, that's great. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I've got one, and it's a bit personal, so please, feel free to ignore it. But I wonder if you could talk about the impact. Like, does your practice have an impact on your relationships? Given the intensity of the work that you're doing in this in this art documentary kind of space. I mean, I can't even language it. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the impact of that on your relationships with those people.
Yeah, like I don't know, it's hard to answer. Like it doesn't, I guess because I've been photographing since such a young age, like I started as a teenager. It's like people always know me to be photographing. Like I was always photographing community. But it doesn't impact our relationships. I guess, yeah, I don't know.
I was just thinking about, when you showed the image of the coffin, and you talked about, it just seems to me that the work you're doing, there's implicit in that work is such a multifaceted and rich understanding of that human being.
Yeah.
And that's clearly not in the archive. That's clearly in the archive that you're bringing. It's like that person is gotten by you and by an audience in a way that the archive, that's impossible in that archive. And I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, like a lot of the time, like I'm invited to photograph funerals. Like, I question it. I feel intrusive, but I don't ever photograph unless I'm invited to. So yeah, like, and as well, like I'm very much within the work, but not photographed, because I'm constantly either behind the camera or like as you can see in the documents, they're not very close. A lot of the letters are to me, or are written by me to them. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It gives us a sense of that relationship.
Yeah, I'm very camera shy, which was why it was really hard to photograph my twin, because it was like I'm looking at myself. And obviously I have a low self-esteem, and photographing somebody who looks like you is hard. But I'm trying to work on incorporating my own story as well. Maybe there'll be portraiture, I don't know.
Look, we're going to leave it there, but I can't thank you enough, on behalf of everybody here. I said this to you earlier. The people of Melbourne are certainly talking about home truths. It's, it's an incredible work. But really, I thank you for your generosity and vulnerability and your willingness to share your practice so wholeheartedly. We really, really appreciate it. And on behalf of everyone at the university here, good luck with your presentation for your PhD. I can't believe you took time out of the schedule to do this for us. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great, great, great,
Thank
great.
you.
Well, thank you to everyone in Zoom land, and thank you for everyone here at Federation Hall. We look forward to you joining us next week, next Thursday, 12:15 for Art Forum continuing. Cheers.
Mate, how do I get out of this?
We will finish the Zoom.
Yeah.
And we'll leave you. But thank you so much, Rafaela. That was great.
Thank you. I'm trying to, it won't let me leave. Okay, I found it. Thank you.